Excited to call us to order on this, the third session of the symposium. This session is titled Counter Narratives of Migration, and we will begin with Antonio Vasquez. I will ask, after all of the presentations, please clap. Give them applause. We'll hold questions until the end, and we'll do questions afterwards.
Is this active? Good morning, everyone. Well, yes. Thank you all for being here. I'm very happy to be here as well. I apologize because I don't have a presentation. That's one whammy. And the second whammy is that I don't have, I'm going to be reading off of a paper. Right, so that's another. So again, my name is Antonio Vasquez, and I'm going to be presenting over this topic of narratives of migration, focusing on Operation Lone Star in particular. Right? Operation Lone Star. In 2000, the UN General Assembly adopted a protocol to prevent, suppress, punish trafficking in persons as a supplement to the Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. There were three objectives. The first was to prevent and combat trafficking in persons, especially women and children. The second, the protocol emphasized the need to protect and assist the victims of such trafficking. The third, the protocol sought to promote cooperation among participating nations. Support for the protocol, which went into effect in 2003, was strengthened by legislation passed by participating nations. In the U.S., support was realized in the signing of the Victims of Trafficking and Violence Protection Act of 2000, which was subsequently renewed several times in 2003, 2006, 2008, 2013, and 2018. One underlying message behind this legislative support is that human trafficking is an important issue, and political leadership will use whatever resources available to counter, to combat, to stop it. I want to complicate this view by examining how the language of human trafficking has also been used to perpetuate conditions of exploitation and vulnerability for recent migrants subjected to the deportation era, to use the expression by Rita Ida Buff. In rhetoric in the United States, Operation Lone Star serves as one case study in this essay. Announced by the Texas governor in March of 2021, Operation Lone Star is a state-funded multi-billion-dollar business that deploys state law enforcement officials to high-threat areas along the Texas-Mexico border to deter migration to the United States. The success of Operation Lone Star is due in part to normalization of xenophobia as promulgated, building off the Trump campaign in the presidency, including the conflation of human trafficking with immigration enforcement. Abbott employed the same approach to justify the purpose and expansion of Operation Lone Star within the framework of national security. From this perspective, Operation Lone Star is a necessary counter to stop human trafficking and to keep communities safe, especially children. I challenge this view by demonstrating how Operation Lone Star, partly justified through the human trafficking narrative, builds upon and accentuates the continued criminalization of primarily Black and brown migrants and the militarization of the Texas-Mexico border. Operation Lone Star should thus be positioned and opposed as the most recent rendering of state violence. Since taking office in 2015, the Texas governor has condemned the state to the center of growing political nativism in the U.S. In 2017, he signed Senate Bill 4, we know about that, which targets local jurisdictions that do not cooperate with federal immigration enforcement. Initiated by State Senator Charles Perry of Lubbock, Senate SB 4 allows the state government to charge local officials with the crime, remove them from office, and impose fines. Abbott has also supported legislation that restricts how race relations can be discussed in classrooms, enables citizens to buy and carry handguns without a license, changes election rules to increase voter suppression, and bars most abortions from being performed in the state. Abbott's platform greatly benefited from the Trump presidency. Speaking at the White House in 2020, then Trump described Abbott as a very special governor. Their highly publicized special relationship stems partly from Abbott's expanding political ambitions, including an endorsement by Trump in his most recent re-election in 2022. There's also synchronization of policies and approaches. For this reason, as early as October of 2017, one observer noted that Donald Trump is pushing policies that Greg Abbott has crafted in Texas. That is, Greg Abbott playbook is what Donald Trump is trying to do. And this certainly reflects Abbott's active push for immigration enforcement, which has continued beyond the Trump presidency with equally damaging results. One key element that has defined Abbott's political career to date was the launching of Operation Lone Star in 2021. Under this initiative, the Department of Public Safety troopers, Texas Rangers, Texas National Guard members, in collaboration with local police, are deployed again to high-threat areas along the Texas-Mexico border. This operation follows the prevention through deterrence model that was enacted in the 1990s, such as Operation Gatekeeper, Operation Hold the Line, and the like. The intention is that law enforcement personnel deployed to the border would, through their mere presence, act as a deterrent to migration. According to Abbott, from deterring illegal immigration to preventing the smuggling of drugs and weapons to curtailing human trafficking, the deployment of resources and personnel needed to arrest and jail criminals along the border is imperative to our comprehensive border security strategy under Operation Lone Star. Like Trump, Abbott has also justified his approach through a lens of national security. That is, he has used his platform to portray immigrants as foreigners and thus threats to the nation to advance his immigration enforcement agenda. As one example, just after COVID-19 in early 2021, Abbott criticized the Biden administration for causing physical harm to the health and the well-being of citizens in his state. The Biden administration has been releasing immigrants to South Texas, according to Abbott, that have been exposing Texans to COVID. In that same year, he claimed that homes are being invaded and farmers were losing their livestock and crops because of the carnage that is being caused by people who are coming across the border. In a subsequent interview in January of the following year, Abbott further criticized the Biden administration for failing to keep communities safe from threats of violence. Abbott first cautioned against immigrants who come from more than 150 countries around the globe to the Texas-Mexico border. We have a president who's in charge, who's not protecting us from our national security by allowing people from terrorist-based nations to cross the border. At the very least, these statements create a sense of fear and loathing. In this view, immigrants do not come to the United States out of necessity to better their lives and the lives of others. They come to invade, to cause harm, to destroy. Another key component has been the issue of human trafficking. This focus is not particular to the current governor. As early as 2003, 3 years after the UN protocol, state leadership in Texas passed its own version and its own legislation to define human trafficking. In subsequent years, state legislators from both political parties provided additional support to raise awareness as an attempt to stop human trafficking. Texas has consistently been one of the most active states in the nation with respect to legislation around this issue. Abbott as well supported these efforts in his previous role as state attorney general. In his 2004 gubernatorial campaign, he identified sex trafficking in particular as modern-day slavery in one of his top 10 issues for his campaign. Abbott's promotion of human trafficking awareness has continued in his current role, and as recent again in January 2022. We must stand unified against human trafficking in Texas to work to end the exploitation of women and children. Pertinent to this study, his call to stand against human trafficking has taken place alongside the push for immigration enforcement. This convergence was most visible when Abbott announced the expansion of Operation Lone Star to include anti-human trafficking efforts. The occasion was the establishment of temporary shelters by federal emergency management agencies to house unaccompanied minors apprehended at the border, primarily from countries in the Northern Triangle. President Biden charged FEMA and the U.S. State Department of Health and Human Services at this time with the task of expanding shelter capacity and providing necessities to youth on a temporary basis. Localities were defined for this purpose, including in Dallas at the Kay Bailey Hutchinson Convention Center, the Freeman Coliseum in San Antonio, and a former camp of field workers in Midland. So speaking about this conference, Abbott criticized the Biden administration, accusing it of creating humanitarian crisis at the border, enriching cartels, smugglers, and human traffickers who often prey on and abuse unaccompanied minors. Not surprisingly, there's been also several criticisms about about Abbott in this initiative that was promoted by the Biden administration. One Dallas County judge, Clay Jenkins, criticized the governor for politicizing the plight of these youth as a distraction from his failed leadership with respect to COVID-19 vaccine and the devastating winter storm that shut down the state in February of 2021. Another advocate from Raíces noted that Abbott's political rhetoric has consistently contributed to the dehumanization of and attacks against migrant children. Another advocate from the Texas Organizing Project cautioned against the governor's attempt to use the dire situation of unaccompanied migrant children to advance his push for immigration enforcement. Building upon these, including work from the ACLU of Texas, a study that was done by the ACLU of Texas in collaboration with the Texas Civil Rights Project, the Texas Fair Defense Project, and others, that call for a full investigation by the U.S. Department of Justice into Operation Lone Star for federal civil rights violations, such as violation of Title VI in the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that bars discrimination based on race, color, and national origin. I also think it's important to offer a critique of Operation Lone Star from the perspective of human trafficking, using the definition and the language of human trafficking that was promoted back in 2000 by the United Nations. And it's a long definition, but the point is that persons are enticed, can be enticed or recruited by force or coercion, and then they're subjected to complete control over another person for the purpose of exploitation. And so there exists several congruences between the lens of human trafficking and practices of apprehension and detention by migrants under Operation Lone Star. One example, in some instances, officers encouraged migrants to break criminal trespass laws in order to arrest them and incarcerate them. And then there are several testimonies, and I'm just thinking as well about the more recent, the earlier conversation about the busing of migrants from Texas to other localities and others across the state that was shared in the earlier presentation. That adds another layering to this lens of human trafficking. Another resonance is that migrants are arrested and held captive against their will. Hundreds of those that have been arrested and under Operation Lone Star have been incarcerated for weeks and months without court dates or a defense attorney. They are completely dependent on law enforcement officials. And then, of course, the purpose is exploitation, right? And it's as I mentioned, Operation Lone Star is a multi-billion-dollar business. It punishes migrants coming to the United States, but at the same time, there's an economic benefit gained from businesses, local governments in localities from arresting and incarcerating migrants under this operation. In one respect, and I argue that in short, like other human trafficking endeavors, Operation Lone Star is a business that thrives off the exploitation of human beings, right? So, on the one hand, since the 21st century, we know that The language of human trafficking has become part of this global political discourse with the adoption of the UN Protocol in 2000. Participating member nations, including the United States, created and adopted their own legislation in concert with the United Nations. In 2003, state leadership from Texas also pursued similar legislation. So there's at this point, greater sensibility around and abhorrence toward human trafficking. At the same time, the modern era of globalization has facilitated the proliferation of exploitation, and nations have played a role in fomenting conditions of those exploitation. Part of the challenge in the current political moment is to remove the legitimacy of the state as the sole authority in what constitutes human trafficking. And at the very least, this removal is necessary to shed light on the complicity of the state in creating and perpetuating violent conditions of human trafficking in the name of combating human trafficking. Such is the case with Operation Lone Star, the most recent manifestation of state violence in Texas.
Thought I had the notification for that off. Awesome. Next, we have Cecilia Hill.
Can you see me over the podium? So yes, Cecilia Sanchez Hill. I'm a PhD candidate here at TCU, finishing this semester. I wasn't sure that this my paper here really fit with the rest, but I think it's going to come together at the end here. This is essentially the dissertation. So I'm going to do, the dissertation in 15 minutes, maybe. I don't know, we'll see. But my dissertation has a case study in Fort Worth ISD, but I'm not going to get into Fort Worth today. It's a broader overview of the dissertation as a whole. But Fort Worth has been an interesting case study to bring this to light. Let's see. Does mine work? Yeah. So in the middle of a U.S. history lesson, an 8th grade Latina student in an urban school district raised her hand and asked me, "Mrs. Hill, did any Mexicans sign the Declaration of Independence?" In the brief moment that I paused and I realized I had already taught more than a century's worth of U.S. history and had not mentioned Mexicans once, a white male student laughingly responded, "Nope, no beaners." So, after dealing with that child, I did my best as a first-year teacher with limited content knowledge beyond the Texas Essential Knowledge and Skill Standards to provide a little bit of Mexican-American history. It was clear that such content was relevant to both students, the one who was longing to see herself reflected back in the history of her nation, and the other, who at 13 years old had already formed an opinion of Mexicans as an other, undeserving of respect. It was also clear that by the 8th grade, my students had not received a full account of U.S. history, and instead they learned an white-centric narrative that celebrates linear progress of white Americans, and without acknowledging the structures of white supremacy that ensured the subjugation of people of color. This is my 8th grade classroom. This is the first year I started teaching. I don't know if you can see much detail from where you're sitting, but if you're a Mexican-American student in that classroom, you don't feel a real connection to the content that I'm teaching, if you can see there. Whether due to a lack of teachers or administrators who look like them, a curriculum that does not include their histories, or the constant patriotic rhetoric in the content that demands unwavering loyalty to the United States, Mexican and Mexican-American students have struggled to form a sense of identity that includes a positive perspective of themselves, their families, and their ancestors. And, like the boy with the no beaners comment, white students have learned to perceive Mexican origin people as at best newcomers, and at worst a threat to their American way of life. The curriculum and instruction of Mexican-American students in Texas public schools throughout the 20th century played a significant role in the formation of their identities. The social studies content, the white architects of that content, and the assumptions about their students that mostly white educators brought to the classroom are factors in understanding how schooling forced Mexican-American students to question the value of their culture. Mexicanos did not passively accept an educational system that treated their children as inferior to the dominant group. They contested and sought to shape schooling for their benefit. Local and state governments in the United States have always used curriculum as a political tool. It is not and never has been neutral. Whether unilaterally deciding what knowledge is most worth learning, sorting children by assumed future abilities, devaluing non-white cultures and implementing assimilation strategies into the classroom, educators and politicians have delivered a curricula that reinforce America's social order and silence those deemed unworthy of inclusion. Altering and erasing the memory of historical events and people in textbooks and classrooms is a powerful tool in the creation and maintenance of white supremacy. For people of color, the absence of counter-narratives of marginalized groups in social studies curriculum is self-evident. However, what is not known is the many decisions made by the white architects of education in Texas that led to the elimination of Mexicanos from the mainstream narrative of United States history. The historical literature on schooling for Mexican and Mexican Americans has recovered a history of both discriminatory treatment in schools and contestation of that treatment by parents, students, lawyers, and activists. Historians have focused on the creation of Juan Crow education, students' experiences of it, and the local community's activism to change those circumstances. Throughout each of these studies, it's clear that school administrators and educators segregated Mexican origin students from their white peers. They did here in Fort Worth, even though they claim they didn't. In these separate spaces, Mexicanos experienced inferior buildings, untrained teachers, limited access to knowledge. This schooling perpetuated social and economic inequalities. These studies have also highlighted the direct action of families and community leaders to change these conditions. Some of those battles took place in the judiciary. Across the Southwest, Mexican Americans and their lawyers, their civil rights attorneys made judicial attempts to, in multiple arenas, including segregation, funding, special and bilingual education, school closures, undocumented students, higher education funding, and high-stakes testing. These studies also discuss the struggles for bilingual education. English-only laws in Texas led to horrific interactions between white teachers and Spanish-speaking students. Teachers placed their fingers in the mouths of the students who struggled to sound out words with the accurate pronunciation and attempted to manipulate the students' tongues and lips to move correctly. Expectedly, students of Mexican origin did not succeed in this environment, leading to massive elementary school failures and dropouts that solidified white American teachers' belief in the inferiority of their brown students. School districts in rural Texas often ignored the state compulsory attendance laws, choosing not to enforce these laws in Mexican neighborhoods. Powerful growers worried how education might change the status among their laborers. They would say things like, if Mexicans learn, then farmers can't handle them as well as they do now. They will unionize and ask for higher wages. Others stated, I'm for educating and educating my own children, but not the Mexicans. Mexicans get some education and then they can't labor. They think it's a disgrace to work. The illiterates make the best farm labor. And if Mexicans get educated, they will go into the cities where they can get more. Those with the power to enact change did not see a need for change. As long as Mexican agricultural laborers lacked the means for upward mobility, both economically and socially, then the powerful, politically connected growers continued to have a cheap labor force that they could exploit. A Texas superintendent of schools in 1930 stated, most of our Mexicans are of the lower class. They transplant onions, harvest them. The less they know about everything else, the better contented they are. The white people claim that when a Mexican gets a little education, he wants to become a contractor. So you see, it's up to the white population to keep the Mexican on his knees in an onion patch or in new ground. This does not mix well with education. As Mexicanos migrated into urban cities, city leaders often viewed them just as birds of passage, not their responsibility to educate. In the first couple decades of the 20th century, it was Catholic, Presbyterian, and Methodist churches that took on the role as educator of these Mexican children, with the intention of still making them as American, assimilating them. In the late 1960s, and I just want to say that that's my mother in the middle, and her brother, and it's at that age that they were working in the fields. And then the top left picture is a Mexican-only school in Fort Worth called Katy Lake Elementary School. And you can kind of see, if I was in a class, I'd ask y'all to tell me what you see in that picture, but I only have 15 minutes. And so you can see they're at various ages. That's one classroom. You can see the building in the back of what the classroom was. I mean, there were brick building schools in Fort Worth at this time. So I just kind of wanted to point out. In the bottom right is the San Mateo School for Mexican children. So just wanted to point out. Oh, and then the far right picture at the top is my second great grandfather and second great grandmother, also farm laborers for their entire lives. In the late 1960s, after I'm jumping, I just jumped a lot. In the late 1960s, after decades of constructing inferior education for Mexicanos in Texas, the white architects faced newly elected Mexican-American politicians who arrived in these traditionally white spaces with their lived experience in Texas public schools and a clear agenda to build new policies and programs for the benefit of their children. At the same time, grassroots activists, or Chicanos, who pushed beyond the accommodationist methods of their elders, put education discrimination front and center in local, state, and national political discourse. This Chicano-era activism emerged during a wave of new federal education programs and the latest pedagogical theories regarding language acquisition and multicultural education. All of these factors coalesced in the 1960s and provided Mexicanos in Texas with the opportunities to force the state to address the community's long-held concerns. That is Dr. Omar Garza. He's the first Mexican-American to serve on the State Board of Education. And not long into his tenure, he made a suggestion about just abolishing the State Board of Education because they were just not helping at all. He only served one term. Every conference held, committee form, and commission report written during the late 1960s and through the 1970s was a new opportunity to change the trajectory of education for Mexicanos in Texas. The first wave of discourse mostly focused on bilingual education and the benefits of teaching a second language by first instructing their students in their mother tongue. After several studies, and language experts no longer believed that drills and memorization was the proper method for language acquisition, experts pushed to end the English-only techniques in classrooms. Teaching in Spanish opened the doors for teaching Spanish and Mexican culture. A few invited speakers at the very first major statewide conference for the benefit of Mexican-American education held in San Antonio in 1967 mentioned the lack of content in classrooms that included the contributions of Mexicanos in history classes as an issue they needed to address. The one-sided narrative of social studies curriculum that placed the dominant culture as superior to all others was the ultimate concern of the SBOE's Committee on the Confluence of Texan Cultures. Their position statements were extraordinarily progressive for the SBOE and had real potential to influence curriculum development and textbook production and selection. Also influencing social studies curriculum in the 60s was the Texas Council for Social Studies, an organization established in 1942 and made up of social studies educators, experts, and university professors. In 1969, the SBOE, the state board, approved the council's recommendations to change the structure and pedagogical practices in social studies classrooms. The federal government established the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights and began investigating and issuing reports on the education of Mexican Americans across the Southwest in 1968 with the final report in 1974. As Mexicans formed local and state committees to bring their concerns to school boards armed with these reports, Chicanos led walkouts to demand change on their campuses. Both methods were necessary for progress. This area of Mexican-American educational activism, while still concerned with segregation and language, expanded to include discussions of the lack of inclusive curriculum, discrimination on campuses, and the dearth of Mexican-Americans in educational decision-making positions. From 1967 until the mid-1970s, progressive and state and local leaders, white, black, and brown, with support from federal funding, pushed public schooling toward inclusivity. These leaders engaged in discussions that moved Mexican-origin children from the margins to the center, supported progressive position statements, and authorized new programs that aimed to finally provide equality education for Mexicanos. However, these newly elected progressive leaders did not have the numbers or the power to push through the wall of established conservative white men who use their positions to maintain white supremacist social hierarchies. Ultimately, established leaders made empty promises and allowed only minimal change. More recently, in the pockets across the Southwest, Mexican American high schools and colleges have won access to Chicano studies. I jumped again in a lot of years. And ethnic studies courses. Prior to 2010 ban on ethnic studies in Arizona, Mexican American students who enrolled in those courses scored higher on exams, graduated at higher rates, and went to college in high numbers. Although Arizona authorities incorrectly claim that these courses advocated for the overthrow of the U.S. government, encouraged resentment of the white race, and only admitted students of color, those in power felt a loss of control over the threat of empowered minoritized people and again took steps to halt their progress. To push back on small steps forward like this, states created new curriculum standards for history courses that re-inscribe the well-established traditional narrative that leaves out histories of people of color. In addition to upholding national myths to create patriotic Americans, this history erroneously uplifts the United States as a meritocracy, Any mention of black and brown people in these histories are littered into errors as tokens and allow the writers of these standards and textbooks to check off boxes. Even though the State Board of Education has recently adopted a Mexican American Studies course, the Texas Essential Knowledge and Skill Standards for the mandatory U.S. courses either wholly dismiss the history of Mexicans or paint an inaccurate and damaging image of Mexicans in the United States. The first mention of Mexicans in social studies classes is in the 4th grade, when teachers tell the story of white American heroes who fought for freedom against tyrannical Mexicans, represented by Santa Anna. 7th grade teachers cover the Mexican period in Texas and the Texas Revolution in more detail than in 4th grade. However, students learn the history solely from the perspective of the white Texans, rather than Mexicans who lived and experienced the various governments, leaders, and cultures that shifted from Spanish to Mexican to Texan and finally to American in less than 3 decades. In these Texas history classes, stories of missions and presidios during the Spanish colonial period quickly transitioned to the influx of white Americans and the heroism of diverse defenders who gave their lives at the Alamo, leaving out the influence of Mexicans on the history of Texas. The TEKS for secondary education social studies continue the erasure of Mexican Americans in U.S. history classes. In the 8th grade, students learn the consequences purportedly violating American sovereignty in the prelude to the Mexican-American War. The superior American military responded to the shedding of American blood on American soil by fighting a fair and square war against their aggressors. The inferior Mexicans consequently give up part of their land. The people on the land become American citizens and retain their private property. And last, the American government pays Mexico $15 million for their trouble, but it was not a war conquest. The final year in which Mexican Americans in the Southwest, are mentioned in U.S. history classes is the 11th grade. Moments of Mexican American history are added and stirred into the master narrative of U.S. history. Mexican repatriation included in the discussion of the Great Depression. The Chicano movement is mentioned as an example of other civil rights movements alongside American Indian and women's movements. However, without any Mexicano voices in the decades leading up to the 1960s, there is no context for the movement. Chicano murals is listed as an example of a cultural movement in art, but again, the movement lacks meaning without an earlier discussion of the Mexican-American experience. The revised standards included an expectation for students to describe how litigation, such as the Mendez case, Hernandez, Delgado, and Bastrop, played an important role in protecting the rights of minorities during the Civil Rights Movement. Each of these judicial fights are meaningful to the history of Mexican Americans in the United States, but again, they have no context for that significance. That's it. Mexicanos are not discussed in any other moments in U.S. history. Even though Mexican Americans earned the most congressional medals of honor during World War II, they are not explicitly listed as examples of groups who provided bravery and contributions to the conflict. I will skip to the end. Allowing the master narrative of American history to persist guarantees a continuation of white supremacy in the United States, where a reaction to 11-year-old San Antonio-born mariachi star Sebastian de la Cruz, dressed with pride in his traje de charro and passionately singing the Star-Spangled Banner, is to express outrage on Twitter by calling him a wetback, beaner, and illegal, with the hashtags You're Not American and hashtag Go Home. This attempted erasure is a modern-day effort of white colonizers to continue the extinction project begun by their ancestors in eliminating non-white people from the land and from the historical narrative. Learning only this narrative ensures the dominant group's view of people of Mexican origin who encourage the continuation and celebration of Mexican culture and who demand a voice and representation in all aspects of life in the country as a threat to their power.
Awesome, thank you so much. And now our final presenter will be Paul Del Bosque.
All right, hey everybody, my name is Paul Del Bosque. I'm coming from the University of Texas at Austin. And I'm going to get started first with a 45-second clip here from the Texas Archive of the Moving Image.
Mexican refugees who fled the fury of Hurricane Beulah await transportation home. More than 15,000 people are still being housed in schools and other public buildings. Army helicopters are loaded for the sentimental journey back to areas that were battered in a 6-week deluge of heavy rains and widespread flooding. As the refugees returned to Mexico, Hurricane Fern struck the northeastern part of the country, touching off more heavy rain. Some flooding occurred at Tampico, but further floods were not expected on the Texas side of the Rio Grande, where Beulah raged.
So I'd like to start with that news clip just to help set the scene, but also to illustrate how the dominant media narrative in the United States was casting these military officials in the U.S. In the best possible light, in this heroic, altruistic kind of light, juxtaposed with the noble and gracious Mexican refugees. The subtext to that newsreel is that, don't worry, the Mexicans are going back, right? After Hurricane Beulah flooded the Rio Grande Valley in September of 1967, an estimated 20,000 people evacuated the state of Tamaulipas across the opened border of Texas. And throughout the borderlands, these unhoused and displaced refugees disappeared into an unknown archive of destinies. In this project, I argue that Hurricane Beulah is a case study in border management and human mobility that illuminates the history of flood disaster in South Texas and contextualizes modern border policy. It's a story that is overlooked and incomplete. It involves impossible subjects who were leveraged for geopolitical interests by both the patriarchal PR machine of the United States and a Mexican government that was eager to appear emergency ready on the world stage. Remember, they were gearing up for the '68 Olympics at this time. Since the start of the Cold War, the U.S. emergency state had been designed to respond to nuclear threats and local evacuations, but had not yet been tested with such extensive rescue operations, let alone international evacuations that were prevalent during the 2-week period of Beulah's worst flooding impacts. My work pieces together archives to show how the disaster migration of Hurricane Beulah fits into the Texas-Mexico border history and disaster studies as a catalyst for interrogating the moving targets of power, both human and environmental. All right, let me get the little gizmo here. So this is a map that was published by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in late 1967 that shows the extent of the flood damage. You can see on the far right, the most severe areas of tidal surge occurred in the barrier islands of Texas, as well as the Rio Grande Delta. And there's also severe flooding, as you can see, in the low-lying areas of the sand sheet of the South Texas brush country, and of course the Rio Grande River itself and the Arroyo Colorado, a waterway that runs east-west just above the Rio Grande. What this map does not show was the extent of the flooding in Tamaulipas. There's a very large reservoir, the Marte Gomez Reservoir, that lies in Tamaulipas to the southwest. And during the worst torrential rains of Beulah, the dams were opened up to allow the floodwaters to escape that reservoir. But what ended up happening is that it flooded the Arroyo Colorado and all the Texas communities that line that waterway. So this aerial shot shows an example here of the severity of those floods. This is the town of Comales, Tamaulipas, just on the edge of the Marte Gomez Reservoir. And you can see here the inundation to this residential area. Now, as I mentioned before, the International Boundary and Water Commission, in conjunction with the Diaz-Ordaz administration and the Johnson administration, officially opened the border of Texas to allow evacuees to escape the floods in Tamaulipas. And this shot here shows a group of them evacuating into Rio Grande City, Texas. Now, the International Suspension Bridge lies, to the far left of the photo, but what we see here is the group of refugees entering the state of Texas. And you can see here just how severe the floodwaters are on either side of this road here. Now, they were escaping to various, like I said, unknown destinies, and these included housing with friends and family, public shelters, military shelters, even labor camps that were opened up in towns like Westlaco. And they had to make do with whatever materials they had available because children were being born. People needed health care. People were sick. And so this shot here shows an example of an incubator that was put together with cardboard and tape to help support the children that were born there. There was over 16 babies that we know of that were reported being born in the hurricane shelters there in South Texas, two Mexican refugee mothers. And so this culminated in an official visit by Lyndon Johnson. This shot here from the Valley Evening Monitor on September 29th, 1967, shows him speaking to some of the refugee children at Fort Ringgold, which is in Rio Grande City. It actually doubles as a Rio Grande City high school currently. And it's highly symbolic that Lyndon Johnson, when he flew down to survey the floods in South Texas, it's highly symbolic that he chose to visit a Mexican refugee shelter and speak to, I mean, there were over 3,000 people that were being housed there. So as I dug through the archives for this project, I located dozens of interesting topics and threads that I wanted to chase down. And there's so much that I grouped them into several key themes here that I wanted to explain. The first, of course, is the historical record of media narratives. Now, Hurricane Beulah made landfall in Port Isabel, Texas, with 130-mile-per-hour winds. So at the time, the Saffir-Simpson scale did not exist, but if it had, it would have been considered a Category 4 hurricane. Just a monstrous storm. It spawned over 100 tornadoes. It inundated places with 3 feet of water, 12-foot tidal surges. So it was a beast. And the official dominant narrative of the United States, you know, it focused on, Hurricane Beulah joined this long history of border reporting that focused on the spectacle that happened because the Texas-Mexico border was often cast as this exotic land of spectacle with things like the Mexican Revolution, prohibition, tourism, disasters, flooding, these kinds of events. And so Beulah was no exception to that. We saw, you know, I uncovered evidence in postcards, in photography books, even in like folklore and corridos. Now there's an archive of disaster corridos about Hurricane Beulah that is a whole other paper, and I would love to dig into that when I get there. But this is a big, complicated history. Okay. The second theme is the built environment and the regulation of mobility. So along the river, there was a series of international suspension bridges, and these bridges they either collapsed or they were rendered unusable because of the severe flooding at the earthen embankments. The bridge that did last was the bridge that connected Roma, Texas to Miguel Alemán. And that bridge still exists today. It's just off to the side of the official, the rebuilt bridge that's made of concrete and came about, I think, in the 70s. I think it was built in the 70s, but the original bridge that was used during Beulah evacuations was decommissioned at that point. We also had, you know, schools and public buildings. There were highways and county roads, and then modes of transportation like buses, helicopters, and trucks that regulated the evacuation and then the mobility of people on both sides of the border. The important thing to keep in mind with the built environment during these storms is that the structures that rose above the floodwaters was all that people had available to escape. And so their mobility was restricted by floodwaters and then regulated by officials that were, you know, funneling them through whatever roadways that existed at the time. And remember that the Eisenhower interstate system didn't quite reach the border at this point, so people were dependent on small county and state roads to evacuate. The third theme is the political profile of the Rio Grande Valley. There were so many forces that were coalescing at this time that Beulah made landfall. The Johnson administration was working on the war on poverty, which was infusing resources into the valley at the time. The 1965 Immigration Act was just starting to affect and change the way people in commerce crossed over the river. The Bracero program had just ended a couple years prior. And there was also a labor strike by Chicano workers in the cantaloupe fields of Starr County that was only broken because Hurricane Beulah made landfall and destroyed the cantaloupe crop and affected all the jobs there, the job opportunities there. And then finally, this all coalesced with LBJ's visit to Rio Grande City. The lasting political legacy of Beulah includes the formation of the Joint U.S.-Mexico Committee on Emergency Planning and Disaster Assistance, which is a mouthful, but their responsibility was to take a look at flood control projects up and down the Rio Grande. And then finally, the military operations and evacuation shelters is the last theme. The military ops and rescue ops constituted what I think of as a disaster industrial complex that involved countless organizations and the Office of Civil Defense, which is the ancestor to modern day FEMA. Operation Bravo was the name of the military operation that was the largest rescue operation to date. And they delivered thousands of people and supplies to places like Fort Ringgold, makeshift clinics, and the Weslaco FSA labor camp. And of course, the crucial story here is the birth of over 16 Beulah babies. 3 of them were actually named Beulah. And, what we know is that they were born. What we don't know is the degree to which the stress on their parents, the risks to their pregnancies, and then the trauma of their own displacement affected their decision to either repatriate to Mexico or stay in the United States to chase job opportunities, connect with family and friends, or just disappear. So what we're dealing with here, like I mentioned before, just to conclude, is an overlooked and impossible cohort of subjects that were navigating the emergency state. This photo here in the Valley Evening Monitor shows some floodwaters in the town of Reynosa, Tamaulipas. So this storm gives us the opportunity to really investigate the foci of power. And usually looking at the foci of power helps us to understand the incentives for migration. But Hurricane Beulah, in the case of Hurricane Beulah, power was a moving target. There was no electricity. There were no telephone lines. The military was highly relying on local residents who had ham radios to communicate with outposts that were dotting the flood zones. Mobility was restricted by the floodwaters and regulated by the disaster industrial complex and then countless organizations. Relief organizations, the American Red Cross, churches, the Boy Scouts, all kinds of groups like that. And so some ongoing questions that linger in this project. Number one is that what was the protocol? What was the actual protocol for opening the border? And this goes back to what Dr. Cano was talking about with his observations at the checkpoints. When you have signage and when you have this built environment, when you have channels that are funneling humans through this process, what happens in an emergency situation when they just throw open the gates and let people cross? What we don't know is how people were kept track of, whether their names were recorded, how they materially and functionally crossed the border and then got on buses. And the fact that county governments and civil defense offices were sending buses to the border to meet them and pick them up, it connects back to when we think of busing now in modern border policy. The second question is, what is Mexico's configuration of this history? There's a whole other archive that exists in Mexico that I've yet to uncover, but that's part of my journey here, and is to find out how they saw it. What was their operation like? An important thing to keep in mind is that the Mexican government was inundated with crises and flood events all over the country because of Hurricane Beulah. So they asked the United States for assistance at the northern boundary, and so that's where Operation Bravo came into being. Lastly, what happens to the migrants and to the survivors of this storm? Part of this journey is to try to track down families whose sense of citizenship and identity as Mexican Americans, as Chicanos, or as repatriated Mexicans were affected by whether or not their families were migrated or whether they evacuated. And it's a subtle but important difference, because in Hurricane Beulah, an evacuation turned into a migration for many, many people. And so the thing I want to leave you with is that this moment brings up, it raises questions about citizenship, it raises questions about trauma, and it raises questions about resilience that has an impact on how we look at disasters to this day. Thank you so much.
Awesome. So thank you again to all of our presenters. I'm gonna flex some moderator privilege and start with a question to all of you. I think a lot of really interesting presentations, Antonio. I loved how you showed us how the actions of the Lone Star Project itself uses the action and logic of human trafficking. Celia, I love the way you profoundly historicized our current educational challenge. As the mother of a second grader, teaching my child about our Indigenous heritage, it's been a challenge, it's been a journey, we'll leave it there. And Paul, I think this was such an interesting story about media narratives. It sort of grounds us in the roots of current conversations, and also really at the end, highlighting these moments of absence in our history, which was also part of Celia's talk. And so, long preamble. With all of this, I was repeatedly struck by how complicated these issues are, how interdisciplinary they are, how intertwined and interwoven they are. Just underscoring the idea that nothing is non-political, right? And I wonder, after all of this, I wonder if I could ask each of you, if you think about your particular perspective on counter-narratives, are there places when you find moments of hope, moments of optimism, movements that excite you or encourage you in our current situation?
Sure. What excites me and moves me are these people sitting at this table right here as far as current movements. I didn't start crying. Yeah, the Ethnic Studies Network of Texas is a major movement, I think, and I talk about it in my epilogue because I saw so many opportunities in the 70s for change, and then it doesn't go anywhere. And so seeing the coalition that exists now, not just with the Ethnic Studies Network, but everybody else that we're in coalition with, it's hopeful. And I think my work can help inform some of that in what we can do differently in changing, not reforming, but transforming education for people of color. So yeah, certainly hopeful.
Yeah, that's a great question. This topic, obviously, for me it includes a lot of really hard stuff, a lot of traumatic stuff, and as we've seen with hurricanes all over the United States, all over the world, natural disasters, it's an unexpected force that renders people completely helpless. State governments completely helpless. All institutions, all infrastructure in our society it crumbles very, very easily. But part of my mission in pursuing this material, and I grew up in South Texas, also on the coast in a hurricane zone, so this stuff is really near and dear to my heart. These are my people, and what I'm trying to do is locate the roots of a hurricane culture where, because of where humans have chosen to settle in these areas, they have a connection to the environment. They have an awareness of the environment, and they have an awareness of weather and how it affects them. That is part of the reason why in the United States, Latinos are the most likely to support efforts for climate change, to impact climate change. There was a survey done by Yale that discovered this, and so everybody found it fascinating. And so part of that is because Latinos, and especially Tejanos in South Texas, just have a natural survival skill for getting prepared for and living through hurricanes. And that's a big part of my story. So that's been a big source of hope for me.
It seems that just reflecting on the conversation in the presentations in the panel before, hope is a thread, right, that continues to interweave these discussions. And it's interesting moment at the time that we're living here in Texas. We're at the center, at the forefront of political nativism. These are bleak times, not just for the state, but for the world. But I'm also hopeful when I look at prior periods of violence, of state violence, and the resiliency of communities here in Texas. And Texas has historically, when we talk about detention and deportation, has really served as a guinea pig, right, for policies that continue to develop through the 20th century. And we are still here. We are still here, and we, for those of us who are sitting here, those of us who are seated in this room at this moment, are here. Not just by our own making, but as a testament to the resilience of those named and unnamed peoples who have lived on this land and have persevered in the face of violence, in the face of trauma, in the face of erasure. That gives me hope. That gives me hope.
So we got about 20 minutes or so for questions, so I'll turn it over to all of you. I will just politely ask, I know we're all great people and I don't need to say that, but I will ask that you make sure your question is actually a question and not a statement of how you would have presented. So.
My question is to Ms. Hill. I really like your presentation, and you said brown erasure in respect of Mexican Americans. But I was curious, when you are saying Mexican Americans, are you saying the Mexican Americans who are actually Spanish speakers and who ended up, in America after the 1848 war? So are you only talking about Spanish-spoken Mexicans or Mexican diaspora in America? And if so, why did you erase the Mexicans who have indigenous background and who have equally, ended up here, maybe not Spanish speakers, but they have their own language, own culture, own history, and they have their own diasporic condition even before the 1848 war. And brown erasure as a theory or methodology applies both to them and to the Mexicans who are Spanish speakers. So I'm just curious if you have left the indigenous Mexican Americans.
Yeah, there's a long footnote at the beginning of the dissertation that explains all that. I use Mexican Americans a lot. I say Mexicanos to include both Mexican Americans as well as Mexican origin people. I use Mexican origin sometimes. I use ethnic Mexican. So it's a combination of all. I mean, I'm not a Spanish speaker, so I certainly, and on my father's paternal side, the border crossed us. So, there's a lot to include in that. Everybody's included in this narrative. However, there are moments when I do need to specify the difference because of who groups were advocating for. There were plenty of times that groups were not advocating for undocumented Mexicanos. They were not. They were only advocating for actual citizens, especially when we get into the 1950s during the Cold War and the LULAC and American GI Forum, who really pushed for Mexican Americans and not Mexicanos. Then we get into the 80s, and there's just whole conversations about Fort Worth ISD pushing undocumented citizens out, late 70s, early 80s, and they're actually trying to. The board makes a decision not to allow undocumented Mexicans to enroll in school, and there's some advocacy for that. So no, the dissertation as a whole includes all aspects of that, but at different times I use different language because I'm being very specific. And when I say Mexicanos, it's all of the above in that sense, but thank you for that.
This question's for Cecilia again. Due to your research and having been a social studies teacher, would you have or do you have a list of topics or recommendations that could be brought to the State Board of Education because they're looking at social studies standards again possibly in 2025?
Yeah, so there's a book titled Latinx Studies K through 12. Oh goodness, that Orlando and I were contributors to. The authors are listed as David Colon and Dr. Max Krochmal, both of them professors at TCU at the time. Krochmal is at University of New Orleans now. And so it's a K through 12 curriculum overlay. So this is not an ethnic studies book, right? The ethnic studies is a powerful movement, and we need to have ethnic studies in all of our schools. Ethnic studies comes with more than just content. It's also a pedagogical strategies, and but with only ethnic studies, we leave the master narrative alone. We let it be. And so the K through 12 overlay is specific opportunities to infuse the curriculum with the perspective of Latinos, or of the Latinx people, not just Mexican Americans, but we include all groups in that, Puerto Ricans, Cubans, Central Americans. And so that's a great tool. It was written specifically for 4th ISD, but then it was published by TCU Press, and so available for all. And that has numerous places. A lot of times some of them were specific to 4th ISD curriculum because we audited their curriculum, but it has like essential questions and overarching themes and actual resources. It's not as useful in book form, in my opinion, as it is for 4th ISD because there's links in there, and those links are long addresses and nobody took the time to make them shorter. So if you're in the book, you have to type out these long addresses, but it's still a very, very useful book, and it begins with a 35-page essay written by Dr. Colon that lays out our histories and how they are American history as well. And so I have yet to get teachers to read all 35 pages. I have tried over and over and found some ways to get them to read pieces of it and then share with each other. I do professional development for the district using that curriculum overlay, and so it does exist, and it's publishable. It's published and it can be purchased on Amazon or wherever else.
When was it published?
It was published in December of 2022. Orlando, do you have it? It's K through 12, or Latinx Studies K through 12 curriculum overlay. Yes, it's TCU Press. You can look up the authors, David Colon, C-O-L-O-N, and Max Krochmal, K-R-O-C-H-M-A-L. But yeah, it's there. It's a great resource for all teachers.
Hi everybody. I don't know about y'all, but I took a lot of notes, and so I have a lot of questions. And it's for everybody, so I hope everyone's okay with it, and you were also thinking the same thing I was. Professor Vasquez, or excuse me, Professor, I wanted to specifically ask, since you're saying that deportation and, right, they're not concentration camps, or at least they're not called that, but down at the detention centers that are concentration camps, you were saying something about the sex trafficking and how it's basically sex trafficking is modern slavery. And I wanted to ask if you knew any statistics of how many migrants are being sexually assaulted by the ICE agents or Border Patrol or whatever name you want to call them.
Wow. I do not know the specific statistics, but I think that's an excellent question, and that's something that we need to think about, right, and find ways to document that, right? Part of the challenge in challenging the narrative is providing the supporting evidence for that, right? And so I think that's a critical point that will need to be explored further.
Have any of y'all read the book Forget the Alamo? Do y'all recommend it? Yes, okay.
Yeah, I do recommend it, yeah. The Alamo, oh my gosh, how much time do y'all have?
What's the thing that was the most, I was wondering if you guys had read it, and then I wanted to know what was the key point that you were like, oh my God, I didn't even know that.
The key point for me is that the people who held up the Alamo as the most sacred Texas myth represented a group of individuals whose, gosh, how do I phrase it? It was a small group of people who were interested in the kind of military action and the kind of independence. And when I say kind, I don't mean just independence. There's a specific kind of independence that they wanted. And this was not the majority opinion for all the people living in Texas in 1836. So that I think is the key takeaway, is that when we think of the myth of the Alamo and the defenders of the Alamo, that was a very small sliver. That was a small minority of people who lived there. There were so many empires at the time that were colliding, and there were so many different interests. There were so many possible destinies that could have taken over Texas, and that just happened to be the one that won out. So putting that into historical perspective was my takeaway.
What's small? Like, give me a number.
Probably like 1,000 people maybe, if that. Yeah.
Okay. And then I have one, actually, a specific question for you, and it's my last question, I promise, so I won't have the mic. What is it? So you were talking about, the natural disaster that's happening at the border, and obviously it's very dear to you because you have, I guess, like a personal connection. But I guess, what do you predict from your research, personal experience, or whatnot about climate change affecting, the whole country, the whole world, and how it's going to basically be, not the agenda, right, but the predictions for the borders?
So the UN Climate Summit, they have, they've registered the lifespan of the Texas coast in a matter of decades. And so we're going to see irreversible change like within our lifetime, is the prediction. What that means is all the human settlements that exist at the coast will have to move inland. And a lot of the built environment will be, start to either fall apart or will have to be reinforced to a point where the cost will be insurmountable. So what I predict is the politics of it are impossible to predict. But we can predict the material impacts. The material impacts will be that building standards will have to change. Construction materials will have to change. We're going to have to change the way we build homes. We're going to have to change the way we reinforce our structures. And that goes for riverine watersheds too. So communities that exist along the Rio Grande and along the Arroyo Colorado will also either disappear because they can't afford to reinforce their dwellings, or they'll move inland, or the housing will become concentrated into high-rise urban planning. And so the border as we know it, and the Gulf Coast border and the riverine border, because I consider those two different borders. Thanks. Yeah, those are two different. The Gulf Coast is the border between land and sea,
Yes.
and we need to think about that as a borderland. It's going to look very, very different, and I think it'll be most apparent in the way building is done, the built environment is done.
Specifically, what I was asking for, I'm sorry, it was about that, right, the science of it, the architecture, everything, but I was specifically asking for culture. How will culture be affected at the border, since they have their own culture down there, and obviously, right, every region of Mexico is different, but I have a prediction of my own, but obviously I'm not as educated as y'all because I only have my bachelor's, but I was wondering if you predict what the culture would be, or for example, if you predict what I predict, which is people will revert back to indigenous practices with the Mexica gods and the way they did agriculture, or would they continue to cede to white modern technology in order to save Earth from climate change?
You just have a bachelor's, really?
These are great questions.
Yeah, I only have a bachelor's. I was like, you didn't ask for a question, yes. Yeah, I only have a bachelor's.
Yeah, no, these are great. These are great questions. Yeah. It's a great line of thinking. It definitely doesn't require any kind of college degrees to reflect on the embodied culture that we grew up with, right? And so that's all I'm doing right now. To answer this question, I have to think back to the way it felt, to prepare and survive hurricanes as a child. And my prediction is that the culture will continue to accommodate survival skills for different kinds of threats, for different kinds of standard temperatures. The rise in the global temperature, it's going to get hot. It's going to get really, really hot. And that rise is going to affect the way our culture responds and commemorates what we lose and what we gain from that exchange, from that relationship to weather and to temperature. The way it connects to our Mexica roots is, it's likely we have to change our food patterns and our eating patterns and our agricultural patterns, and our building patterns, of course. Those methods are time tested when we look back to how the Mexica empires and the Mayan empires and the Incan empires all built their own societies. And so it would be great if we could reduce the cattle ranches and the meat consumption, and revert back to a more, corn and plant-based diet, society-wide. And that may be forced upon us because of climate change. And that, of course, will, maybe spark some creatives and activists and grassroots folks to say, hey, look, it's okay. We've been here before. We have this in our history, in our heritage. So that would be off the cuff, off the top of my head. That would be my prediction.
I think we have about 3 minutes left, and I do smell our food outside, I think. So if there's a very quick question, we can take one more.
Specific one, we brought up the issue of the busing. Has anybody who's been criticizing the busing from Florida, have they made the comparison to sex trafficking? Because you're often moving people who are given misinformation of what's going to happen to them. So have that been used? Because I can see it could be used in really good ways.
It should, yeah. No, I mentioned that based on my reflection of the presentation this morning, looking at the human trafficking, that the 100,000 migrants who are being bused, right, who are being human trafficked, right? And I think that that's certainly another point that needs to be a point of contention, right, that we need to amplify in this conversation.
All right. Okay. Very quick. Super quick.
Hello. Thank you. I will delay my introduction because it is super quick. But I have come into some of the knowledge that you all presented today, and working and living in Fort Worth ISD, I started a nonprofit that seeks to share some of the indigenous and cultural history of Black and brown people to children in Fort Worth ISD. I was unfortunately I caught the tail end, but I was very intrigued on sharing this information, particularly through K through 12, as professors and as educators. What advice or what recommendation would you give specifically to business owners, nonprofit owners, educators that are working in Fort Worth ISD or after school to share this information in a way that's palatable enough to be accepted and disseminated as it should?
Okay, 30 seconds each.
Yeah, I'll just say, for children, for elementary school, for young kids, all grade levels, K through 12, I'm gonna sell the book again. There are books listed in there per grade level of having after school programs where those books exist. If there can be a business that supports and purchases those books for this organization, there can be conversations around these stories that will help build that knowledge. And they are listed in there, and they're listed by grade level and reading level, and they make them accessible. So no matter what age your kids are in K through 12, there is something there available for them. That's a great way to do it. I'm happy to help. There's just so many resources in there. And if they're, like I said, businesses willing to donate some money, then that's always helpful as well. And look to in Fort Worth ISD, look to Joe Nigella in the Social Studies Department. They're pretty helpful and supportive. Joe Nigella, he's the Director of Social Studies for Fort Worth ISD, Director of Humanities now. Look for him for some support as well.
Okay, I think that's also a great question to pause and lead into our next session, which will be about developing an authentic and accurate American Indian Native Studies. So it'll address some of those questions. With that, let's give our presenters